The rain was relentless that November evening in Portland, Oregon. I remember the sound of it hammering against the windshield of my old Honda as I drove home from the grocery store. At 68, I had learned to be cautious on wet roads, but sometimes caution isn't enough. The traffic light ahead turned yellow, and I slowed down, my arthritic fingers gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the screech of tires behind me. Before I could even process what was happening, a massive truck slammed into the back of my car with such force that my world exploded into glass and twisted metal. The impact threw me forward, and even though my seatbelt caught me, I felt something inside me break. The pain was instant and overwhelming, radiating from my chest and down my spine. Everything after that became a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and voices I couldn't quite understand. I remember being lifted onto a stretcher, the cold rain mixing with the warmth of my own blood. Someone was asking me questions, but I couldn't form words. My mind kept drifting to my children, Dahlia and Douglas. I needed them to know what happened. I needed them to be there when I woke up. The paramedics worked quickly, their hands moving with practiced efficiency as they stabilized me. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, leaned close to my face and said something reassuring, but I couldn't hear her over the roaring in my ears. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of my crumpled car, and a strange thought crossed my mind. After all these years of taking care of everyone else, who would take care of me now? The ride to the hospital felt both endless and instantaneous. I faded in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversations between the paramedics. Words like internal bleeding and critical condition floated around me like dark birds circling overhead. I tried to stay awake, tried to hold on, but the darkness kept pulling me under. My last coherent thought before everything went black was a prayer that my children would forgive me for leaving them this way. When I finally woke up, I was in the intensive care unit at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital. The fluorescent lights above me were too bright, and the constant beeping of monitors created a rhythm that seemed to match my racing heartbeat. My body felt heavy, weighed down by tubes and wires connecting me to machines I didn't understand. A nurse noticed I was awake and came to my side, her face a mixture of relief and concern. She told me I had been unconscious for 2 days. 2 days during which the doctors had fought to save my life, repairing internal injuries and stabilizing my fractured ribs. She also told me something that made my heart sink. They had contacted my emergency contacts, my daughter Dahlia and my son Douglas, informing them of my critical condition. The nurse's expression changed slightly when she mentioned this, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read crossing her features. I asked if they had come to see me, my voice barely more than a whisper. The nurse hesitated, then gently squeezed my hand before walking away to check on another patient. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know, but I wasn't ready to accept it yet. Surely there was a reasonable explanation. Perhaps they were on their way. Perhaps they had been delayed. I clung to these fragile hopes, even as a cold dread began to settle in my chest, heavier than any physical pain. Chapter 2. The phone call. Harrison Chen was the one who finally told me the truth. He was a middle-aged man with graying temples and the kind of gentle manner that made you trust him immediately. He came to my bedside on the 3rd day, pulling up a chair and sitting down with a sigh that suggested he had been on his feet for far too long. His dark eyes studied my face for a moment before he spoke, as if trying to gauge how much honesty I could handle. He explained that my injuries, while serious, were stabilizing. My ribs would heal, the internal bleeding had been stopped, and with time and physical therapy, I would likely make a full recovery. But then, his expression darkened, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He told me that when the hospital staff called my daughter Dahlia, her response had been unexpected, cold even. Dr. Chen's exact words were measured and professional, but I could see the disapproval in his eyes. According to the nurse who made the call, Dahlia had listened to the explanation of my condition with what seemed like impatience. Then, she had said something that Dr. Chen struggled to repeat to me. My daughter had told the hospital staff that I wasn't her real mother, that she and her brother owed me nothing, and that they wouldn't be coming to visit. The nurse had tried to explain the severity of my condition, emphasizing that I might not survive, but Dahlia had simply hung up. I felt as if the truck had hit me all over again. The physical pain I was experiencing was nothing compared to the agony that tore through my heart at that moment. Dr. Chen watched me carefully, ready to intervene if my vital signs became unstable, but I simply stared at the ceiling, trying to process what I had just heard. Not their real mother. We owe her nothing. The words echoed in my mind, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. After Dr. Chen left, I lay there in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the sounds of machines keeping me alive, and I forced myself to confront a truth I had been avoiding for years. Dahlia and Douglas were not my biological children. I had adopted them when they were young, after their birth mother, my cousin Rebecca, died in a car accident 25 years ago. Their father had abandoned them long before that, and I was the only family they had left. I took them in without hesitation, raised them as my own, loved them with every fiber of my being. For 2.5 decades, I had given them everything. I had sacrificed my own dreams of traveling, of pursuing my passion for painting, of maybe even finding love again after my husband passed away when I was 40. Instead, I had worked 2 jobs to put them through good schools, stayed up countless nights nursing them through illnesses, attended every recital and game and graduation. I had been there for every triumph and every heartbreak, always putting their needs before my own. And now, in my hour of greatest need, they had discarded me as if I meant nothing. The realization was crushing, but beneath the pain, something else began to stir. It was a cold, hard anger that I had never allowed myself to feel before. All those years of self-sacrifice, and this was my reward, to be abandoned in a hospital bed, dismissed with cruel words and casual indifference. No, I wouldn't accept this. I wouldn't let this define the end of my story. As the sun set outside my hospital window, casting long shadows across the room, I made a decision. Whatever happened next, I would face it on my own terms. I had survived the accident. I would survive this betrayal too. But first, I needed to understand why my children had turned on me with such venom, and what they meant when they said I wasn't their real mother. Had they always known they were adopted? Had they always harbored this resentment? These questions haunted me through the long, painful night ahead. Darasuri, Chapter 3, Memories of Motherhood. The morphine drip kept the worst of the physical pain at bay, but it did nothing for the emotional wounds that had been reopened. As I lay in that hospital bed, unable to move much without triggering sharp pains in my ribs, my mind wandered through the corridors of memory, revisiting moments I had treasured for so long. Now, those same memories felt tainted, their meaning twisted by the knowledge of my children's betrayal. I remembered the day I brought Dahlia and Douglas home. She had been 7 years old, with wild auburn curls and eyes that held too much sadness for such a young child. Douglas was only 5, a quiet boy who clung to his sister's hand as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had already proven itself unstable. They had lost their mother just weeks before, and I could see the fear and confusion in their faces as I led them into my modest house in the suburbs of Portland. Those first months had been challenging. Dahlia had nightmares almost every night, waking up screaming for her mother. Douglas barely spoke at all, communicating mostly through nods and shakes of his head. I had no experience with children of my own, having focused on my career as a teacher before my husband's death, but I learned quickly. I held Dahlia when she cried, sat with Douglas in comfortable silence, and slowly, painfully slowly, we began to form a family. I remembered the first time Dahlia called me Mom. She was 8 by then, and we were baking cookies together on a rainy Saturday afternoon. She had flour on her nose, and she was laughing at something I had said. Then, without thinking, she had asked, "Mom, can we make chocolate chip cookies next time?" The word had slipped out naturally, and for a moment, she had frozen, as if afraid she had made a mistake. But I had simply smiled and pulled her into a hug, tears streaming down my face. From that day forward, I was mom to both of them. Douglas took a little longer, but eventually, he too began calling me by that precious title. I never tried to replace Rebecca in their hearts. I kept photos of her around the house, told them stories about her when they asked, made sure they knew that loving me didn't mean forgetting her. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought honesty and openness would create a foundation of trust that would last forever. As they grew older, both children seemed to thrive. Dahlia became a confident teenager, excelling in school and making friends easily. She was bright and ambitious, already talking about college and career plans by the time she was 15. Douglas was quieter, more introspective, but he was kind and creative, spending hours drawing and reading in his room. I was so proud of them both, so grateful to be part of their lives. But now, lying in this hospital bed, I forced myself to look at those memories with clear eyes. Had there been signs I missed, moments when they pulled away from me emotionally, times when they seemed to resent my presence in their lives? I replayed countless interactions, searching for clues, but all I found were what I had believed to be normal teenage rebellions and the expected growing pains of young adults establishing their independence. When Dahlia left for college at the University of Washington, I had helped her move into her dorm room, unpacking boxes and making her bed while she chatted excitedly with her new roommate. When Douglas decided to pursue art school in San Francisco, I had driven him down the coast, spending 3 days with him to make sure he was settled. These didn't seem like the actions of children who harbored deep resentment toward me. So what had changed? And when? The night nurse, a woman named Patricia with silver hair and a warm smile, came to check on me around midnight. She must have seen the distress on my face because she paused in her routine checks to ask if I was in pain. I told her the truth. Yes, but not the kind of pain she could help with. She nodded knowingly, having no doubt seen many patients struggling with emotional wounds that ran deeper than physical injuries. Before she left, she squeezed my hand and told me that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us worst. Therefore, Chapter 4, The Lawyer's Visit. On the 5th day of my hospitalization, I received an unexpected visitor. Mr. Timothy Bradshaw was a lawyer who specialized in estate planning, and I had worked with him years ago to set up my will. He was a tall man in his 60s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit despite the casual nature of a hospital visit. His expression was grave as he pulled a chair close to my bed, his leather briefcase resting on his lap. He told me he had heard about my accident through mutual acquaintances and wanted to check on me personally. But I could tell from the way his eyes kept darting away from mine that there was more to this visit than simple concern. After a few minutes of polite small talk, he finally got to the point. He had received a call from my daughter, Dahlia, inquiring about my estate and whether my will had been updated recently. The timing of her call struck me as grotesque. I was still in the hospital, still fighting for my life, and she was already positioning herself to claim whatever I might leave behind. Mr. Bradshaw carefully explained that he had given Dahlia no information, citing attorney-client privilege, but he felt I should know about the inquiry. His professional demeanor cracked slightly, as he added that in his 30 years of practice, he had rarely encountered such cold calculation from a family member. I asked him to bring me a copy of my will. I needed to see exactly what I had left to my children, though I already knew the basics. My house, which was fully paid off and worth a considerable amount given Portland's real estate market, was to be split equally between Dahlia and Douglas. My savings account, which had grown to almost $200,000 through years of careful management, would also be divided between them. Various personal items, including some valuable jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, were specifically designated for Dahlia. As I reviewed the document, my hands trembling slightly from both weakness and anger, I realized that my children stood to inherit close to $800,000 between them. This was the result of a lifetime of frugal living, wise investments, and the decision to prioritize their futures over my own comfort. I had driven the same car for 15 years, lived in the same modest house, rarely traveled, all so that I could leave them financially secure. Mr. Bradshaw watched me carefully as I read, and when I finally looked up at him, he asked the question that I knew was coming. Did I want to make any changes to my will? The old me, the woman who had existed before that phone call from Dahlia, would have immediately said no. I would have made excuses for my children, convinced myself that stress was making them act out of character, clung to the hope that our relationship could be repaired. But I wasn't that woman anymore. The accident and its aftermath had stripped away my illusions, leaving behind a clearer, colder understanding of my situation. I told Mr. Bradshaw that yes, I wanted to make significant changes, but I needed time to think about what those changes should be. He nodded, understanding the gravity of what I was considering, and promised to return in a few days with whatever documents I needed. After he left, I spent hours staring out the window at the gray Portland sky, watching rain streak down the glass. The city I loved, the home I had built for my children, suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a monument to wasted effort. But beneath my anger and hurt, a plan was beginning to form, If my children wanted my inheritance so badly, wanted to reduce me to nothing more than a financial transaction, then I would give them something to remember me by. But it wouldn't be what they expected. A thought occurred to me then, dark and painful. Perhaps they had always seen me this way. Perhaps, despite all my efforts, I had never been more than a convenient caretaker to them, someone who provided stability and resources but could be discarded once her usefulness ended. The thought made me physically ill, and I had to press the call button for the nurse when nausea overwhelmed me. Patricia came quickly, helping me through a wave of sickness that had nothing to do with my injuries and everything to do with the poison of betrayal working through my system. Chapter 5, Dahlia's True Colors. My first conversation with Dahlia happened on the 8th day of my hospitalization. She called my cell phone, which the hospital staff had recovered from my wrecked car, and charged for me. I was sitting in a chair by the window, trying to rebuild my strength through short periods of movement, when the phone rang. Seeing her name on the screen sent a jolt through me, part hope and part dread. I answered, and for a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then Dahlia's voice came through, and I barely recognized it. Gone was any warmth or concern. Instead, she spoke with the crisp, businesslike tone of someone conducting an unpleasant but necessary transaction. She asked how I was doing, but before I could answer, she was already moving on to what really mattered to her, my property and finances. Dahlia told me that she and Douglas had been discussing my situation, and they thought it would be best if I signed over power of attorney to them immediately. That way, she explained in a tone that suggested she was being perfectly reasonable, they could manage my affairs while I recovered. She rattled off concerns about bills needing to be paid, the house needing maintenance, various financial matters that required attention. All of it sounded logical on the surface, but I heard what she wasn't saying. They wanted control of my assets now, while I was vulnerable. I asked her why she had told the hospital we owed her nothing. My voice remained steady despite the hurricane of emotions churning inside me. There was a pause, and I could almost hear her calculating her response. Finally, she laughed, a harsh sound that bore no resemblance to the joyful laughter of the little girl I had raised. She said that she had been emotional, that the shock of hearing about my accident had made her say things she didn't mean. It was a lie so transparent that it would have been insulting if it hadn't been so revealing. Then her tone changed, becoming harder, more honest in its cruelty. She said that she and Douglas had always known I wasn't their real mother. Their father, who had disappeared when they were young, had reappeared briefly when Dahlia was 16. He had contacted her through social media, told her the truth about their adoption, and painted a picture of me as someone who had stolen them away from their rightful family. It was nonsense, all of it, but Dahlia had chosen to believe him. She told me that she had shared this information with Douglas years ago, and together they had come to see me as nothing more than a legal guardian who had taken advantage of their mother's death. In Dahlia's twisted narrative, I hadn't saved them from a life in foster care or potential separation. Instead, I had selfishly kept them from knowing their real family, from connecting with their heritage, all so that I could play at being a mother. I listened to this venomous rewriting of our history with growing horror. How long had they harbored these feelings? How many Sunday dinners, Christmas mornings, and birthday celebrations had they endured while secretly despising me? Every expression of love I had given them, every sacrifice I had made, all of it had been met with hidden contempt. The realization was suffocating. When Dahlia finally paused in her monologue, I asked her one simple question. If she felt this way, why did she want anything to do with my inheritance? Why not just walk away completely and build a life that had nothing to do with me? Her answer was chilling in its honesty. She said that after everything I had put them through, they deserved compensation. The house, the money, all of it was the least I could do to make up for the years I had kept them from their truth. The conversation ended with Dahlia demanding that I meet with them to sign papers transferring my property. She suggested we do it at the hospital before I was discharged, to make it convenient for me given my condition. Her consideration for my comfort would have been touching if it hadn't been so transparently self-serving. I told her I would think about it and ended the call. Then I sat there, phone clutched in my hand, and let the tears come for the first time since the accident. The Murney, Chapter 6, Douglas's Silence. While Dahlia had been cold and calculating, Douglas's response to my accident was somehow worse because it was no response at all. My son, The quiet boy who had once held my hand while crossing streets and whispered that he loved me before bed, said nothing. He didn't call, didn't text, didn't visit. His silence was a void that grew larger with each passing day, swallowing up all the memories I had cherished of raising him. I thought about the last time I had seen Douglas, about 6 months before the accident. He had come to Portland for a long weekend, supposedly to visit friends but stopping by to see me as well. We had gone to our favorite breakfast spot on Hawthorne Boulevard, a small diner where we used to go every Saturday morning when he was in high school. Over pancakes and coffee, he had seemed distant, distracted, checking his phone constantly and giving one-word answers to my questions. At the time, I had attributed his behavior to the natural preoccupation of a 32-year-old man building his career in San Francisco. He was working as a graphic designer for a tech company, doing well from what I could tell, though he rarely shared details about his life anymore. I hadn't pushed, believing that adult children needed their space, and that our relationship was solid enough to weather these periods of distance. How naive I had been. Patricia, my night nurse, had become something of a confidant during my stay. She would sit with me during her breaks, listening as I tried to make sense of my children's betrayal. One night, she shared her own story. Her son had cut her off years ago, blaming her for his father's infidelity and the divorce that followed. She hadn't seen him in over a decade, didn't know if she had grandchildren, existed in a state of permanent grief for a relationship that might never be repaired. Her story was meant to comfort me, I think, to let me know I wasn't alone in experiencing this particular brand of heartbreak. But instead, it filled me with a deep sadness for all the parents who poured their hearts into raising children, only to be discarded when they were no longer useful, or when old resentments, real or imagined, became more important than love and loyalty. The world was full of people like us, carrying wounds that never fully healed. I tried calling Douglas several times, but each call went straight to voicemail. I left messages, my voice cracking with emotion, asking him to please talk to me, to explain what I had done wrong, to give me a chance to understand his perspective. None of my messages were returned. His rejection was absolute, and in some ways, more painful than Dahlia's active cruelty. At least Dahlia was engaging with me, even if it was only to demand my money. Douglas had simply erased me from his life as if I had never existed. The physical therapy sessions were torture, not because of the pain in my healing body, but because they gave me too much time to think. As I slowly walked the halls of the hospital, supported by a therapist named Jerome, who was kind enough not to ask why I sometimes broke down crying mid-session, I replayed every interaction I'd ever had with Douglas. I searched for the moment when I lost him, when I became unworthy of even basic acknowledgement, but I couldn't find it. Had it been gradual, this erosion of our relationship, so slow that I hadn't noticed until it was too late? Or had there been a specific event, some perceived slight that I remained unaware of, that had poisoned his feelings toward me? I would never know unless he chose to tell me, and his silence made it clear that he had no intention of doing so. I was left with questions that would never be answered, and a grief that had no clear path toward resolution. One afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the rain that seemed to define Portland even more than usual that season, I accepted a hard truth. Douglas was not going to call. He was not going to visit. Whatever Dahlia had told him, whatever poison their absent father had fed them, had taken root so deeply that there was no reaching him anymore. My son was lost to me as surely as if he had died, and I had to find a way to mourn that loss while still finding the strength to move forward. Chapter 7. The plan takes shape. By the beginning of my second week in the hospital, I had made my decision. Mr. Bradshaw returned as promised, and this time, I was ready with clear instructions. I wanted to change my will completely, removing Dahlia and Douglas as beneficiaries except for a token amount that would make it clear I had not simply forgotten them. The bulk of my estate would go elsewhere, to places and people who might actually appreciate what I had built. Mr. Bradshaw took notes as I spoke, his expression neutral and professional, though I caught glimpses of approval in his eyes. I designated my house to be sold, with the proceeds going to a local organization that provided housing for foster children aging out of the system. My savings would be divided between several charities: a women's shelter where I had volunteered years ago, a scholarship fund for teachers pursuing advanced degrees, and an animal rescue where I had adopted my beloved cat, Shadow, who had passed away 2 years before. As for Dahlia and Douglas, each would receive exactly $1, along with a letter explaining my decision. Mr. Bradshaw suggested that this token amount was important legally, as it demonstrated that I had not simply overlooked them, but had made a conscious choice to exclude them from any meaningful inheritance. He also recommended that I write my explanation letter carefully, making it clear that this was not a decision made in haste or under duress, but a thoughtful response to their actions. The next item on my agenda was more practical. I needed to leave the hospital, but I couldn't return to my house. Not yet. The thought of being in that space, surrounded by memories of raising my children, watching them grow, celebrating holidays and milestones, it was too much. I needed somewhere neutral, somewhere that didn't echo with the ghosts of a family that no longer existed. I asked Patricia if she knew of any extended stay hotels or temporary housing options. She did better than that. Patricia had a sister who owned a small furnished apartment building in southeast Portland, and one unit had just become available. It was modest but comfortable, and the rent was reasonable. More importantly, Patricia's sister, a woman named Margaret, was willing to be flexible about lease terms given my situation. Within 2 days, arrangements were made. I would move directly from the hospital to this new temporary home, bypassing the house that held too many painful memories. Dr. Chen approved my discharge for the following week, provided I continued with physical therapy and followed up regularly with my primary care physician. My ribs were healing well, and while I still tired easily and dealt with residual pain, I was stable enough to manage on my own. The hospital social worker helped me arrange for home healthcare visits and set up a schedule for outpatient physical therapy sessions. I was slowly rebuilding my life, piece by piece. But there was one more element to my plan, something that felt both vengeful and necessary. I wanted Dahlia and Douglas to come to the hospital thinking they would get what they wanted, only to discover that they had already lost everything through their own cruelty and greed. Mr. Bradshaw was initially hesitant about this theatrical element, but I insisted. I needed them to understand that their actions had consequences, that they couldn't simply discard me and then claim what I had built. I called Dahlia back and told her that I was ready to discuss transferring my property. I asked her to come to the hospital with Douglas, suggesting we could handle everything at once to avoid multiple meetings. The eagerness in her voice when she agreed was nauseating. She told me they would come in 3 days, that they were already making arrangements to fly to Portland. The fact that they could find time to claim my money, but not to check on my recovery, told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. Those 3 days passed in a strange fog of anticipation and sadness. I signed the new will, had it properly witnessed and notarized, and placed copies in a safe deposit box, along with letters to Dahlia and Douglas. Mr. Bradshaw handled everything with quiet efficiency, never once questioning my choices or trying to talk me out of what some might see as a harsh response to my children's behavior. He simply ensured that my wishes would be carried out exactly as I specified. On the evening before their planned visit, I packed the few belongings I had accumulated during my hospital stay. My clothes, washed and folded by the kind hospital volunteers. A few books Patricia had lent me, the flowers that had arrived from my former teaching colleagues, people I hadn't seen in years but who remembered me with more kindness than my own children had shown. I was ready to leave, ready to start over, ready to show Dahlia and Douglas that I was stronger than they thought. Mundsucker Chapter 8. The Confrontation. They arrived at exactly 2:00 on a gray Thursday afternoon, walking into my hospital room with the confidence of people who believed they had already won. Dahlia wore an expensive navy suit that I didn't recognize, her auburn hair perfectly styled, every inch the successful marketing executive she had become. Douglas followed behind her, looking uncomfortable in jeans and a button-down shirt, his eyes refusing to meet mine as he hovered near the door as if planning his escape. I was sitting in the chair by the window, fully dressed in my own clothes for the first time in 2 weeks. The effort of getting dressed had exhausted me, but I refused to face them from the vulnerability of a hospital bed. I needed them to see me as I truly was, diminished by the accident, yes, but not broken, not defeated, not the easy target they had assumed I would be. Dahlia spoke first, her voice carrying that same false warmth she had used during our phone conversation. She asked how I was feeling, made appropriate concerned noises about my injuries, and then, with barely a pause, pulled out a folder of papers she wanted me to sign. Power of attorney documents, she explained. along with some forms related to accessing my bank accounts to handle my expenses while I recovered. It was all very reasonable, she insisted, just taking care of practical matters. I let her talk, watching her performance with detached curiosity. She was good at this, I had to admit. If I hadn't known the truth, hadn't heard the venom in her voice during that phone call, I might have believed she actually cared. Douglas remained silent throughout her presentation, his gaze fixed on some point on the floor, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked like a man who desperately wished to be anywhere else. When Dahlia finally paused, waiting for me to reach for the pen she had helpfully placed on the table beside me, I surprised them both by laughing. It wasn't a bitter laugh, though I felt plenty of bitterness. It was the laugh of someone who had finally understood a cosmic joke. My children, the two people I had loved most in the world, were trying to rob me while I was still alive, and they thought I was too broken to notice or too dependent on their approval to resist. I told them I wasn't going to sign anything. Dahlia's carefully maintained expression cracked, revealing the anger underneath. She started to argue, her voice rising as she listed all the reasons why what she was asking was reasonable and necessary. I interrupted her, something I had rarely done during her childhood because I had always believed in letting her express herself fully. But this wasn't a child's tantrum I was witnessing. This was calculated manipulation, and I was done being manipulated. I told them about the new will. I spoke calmly, detailing exactly what I had done and why. Dahlia's face went through a rapid series of changes, from disbelief to rage to something that might have been panic. Douglas finally looked at me, and for just a moment, I saw something in his eyes that might have been regret, but it passed quickly, replaced by the same shuttered expression he had worn when he entered the room. Dahlia tried to argue that I couldn't do this, that I wasn't in my right mind, that the stress of the accident had made me irrational. She threatened to contest the will, to take me to court, to do whatever it took to get what she believed was rightfully hers. I let her rant, waiting until she ran out of steam before responding. I told her that Mr. Bradshaw had been very thorough in documenting my mental competence, that I had undergone psychological evaluations specifically to prevent any claims that I was acting under duress or diminished capacity. Then I asked them the question that had haunted me since that first phone call. Why? Why had they turned on me so completely? Why had they decided that a stranger's lies about their past mattered more than the 25 years I had spent raising them, loving them, sacrificing for them? Dahlia's answer was as honest as it was devastating. She said that I had never been their real mother, that blood mattered, that I had no right to expect loyalty from children who weren't truly mine. Douglas spoke for the first time then, his voice quiet but clear. He said that he had always felt like he was living a lie, that knowing I wasn't his biological mother had poisoned every memory of his childhood. He claimed that I had robbed him of his identity, that every birthday celebration and school event and family dinner had been a performance built on deception. I wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that love and family were about more than genetics, but I knew he wouldn't hear me. The confrontation lasted another 20 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter. Eventually, Dahlia grabbed her papers and stormed out, her heels clicking sharply against the hospital floor. Douglas lingered for a moment, and I thought perhaps he might say something, offer some small acknowledgement of what we had once meant to each other, but he simply turned and followed his sister, closing the door quietly behind him, and just like that, they were gone. Thakrinom, Chapter 9. The Empty Room. The day after their visit, I checked myself out of the hospital and moved into the small apartment Margaret had prepared for me. It was on the second floor of an older building, with windows that looked out over a street lined with bare trees awaiting spring's arrival. The furnishings were simple but comfortable. A couch that folded out into a bed, a small dining table with 2 chairs, a kitchenette with everything I needed to prepare basic meals. Patricia helped me get settled, carrying my few belongings up the stairs while I moved slowly behind her, still healing but determined to manage this transition on my own terms. She had become more than a nurse during my hospital stay. She was a friend, perhaps the only one I had left in a city where I had lived for decades, but suddenly felt like a stranger. Before she left, she hugged me carefully, mindful of my healing ribs, and made me promise to call if I needed anything. The first night alone in that apartment was harder than I had anticipated. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of traffic from the street below. I made myself a simple dinner of soup and toast, ate it while sitting at the small table, and tried not to think about all the meals I had prepared over the years for a family that no longer existed. After eating, I stood at the window and watched the city lights begin to glow in the gathering darkness. I had left my house exactly as it was, walking out with only what I had taken to the grocery store that fateful day. Everything I owned was still there. Furniture I had carefully selected, books I had collected over a lifetime, photographs documenting years of family history. I knew I would have to go back eventually to sort through it all, decide what to keep and what to let go, but I wasn't ready yet. That house was a museum of my failure to be enough, and I needed more time before I could face it. The physical therapy continued 3 times a week at a clinic near my new apartment. Jerome, my therapist, pushed me to rebuild my strength while respecting my limitations. During our sessions, he shared stories about his own life, his wife of 30 years, his 3 adult children who called him regularly and visited often. I listened to these stories with a mixture of pain and something that might have been happiness for him. At least someone's children had turned out well. Sleep came in fragments those first weeks. I would drift off, exhausted from the day's activities, only to wake at 3 a.m. with my mind racing through memories and regrets. I thought about all the decisions I had made, wondering which ones had led me to this lonely apartment, this dissolution of everything I had believed my life to be. But no matter how many times I replayed the past, I couldn't identify a single moment where I had been the villain my children now claimed I was. Dr. Chen had referred me to a therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Whitmore, who specialized in helping people process grief and loss. I was initially resistant to the idea. I didn't want to be someone who needed therapy, who couldn't handle their problems independently. But the isolation and pain became too much to bear alone, and eventually, I made an appointment. That first session, I cried for an hour straight while Dr. Whitmore sat quietly, offering tissues and gentle understanding. She helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a form of ambiguous loss, grief for people who were still alive but who had effectively died to me. It was complicated grief, she explained, because unlike death, which offers closure and social rituals of mourning, this kind of loss existed in a strange limbo. My children were out there somewhere, living their lives, but they might as well have been ghosts for all the connection we now had. Margaret, my landlord, proved to be another unexpected source of support. She was in her mid-70s, a widow with grown children of her own who lived nearby and visited often. She had a way of showing up with extra cookies she had baked, or a casserole she claimed she couldn't possibly finish alone. We both knew what she was doing, and I was grateful for it. Her kindness reminded me that not all families were broken, that love and loyalty still existed in the world. As February turned into March, I established a routine: physical therapy, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings. Therapy with Dr. Whitmore every Tuesday afternoon. Grocery shopping on Thursday mornings when the store was quiet. The rest of my time was spent reading, watching old movies, and slowly building up the courage to return to my house. I knew the process of sorting through a lifetime's worth of possessions would be emotionally devastating, but it had to be done before the house could be sold. Chapter 10. Facing the Past. It took me until late March to finally return to my house. I chose a Saturday morning, bright and unseasonably warm for Portland, with cherry blossoms beginning to bloom throughout the neighborhood. Margaret offered to come with me for support, but I needed to do this alone. This was my pilgrimage, my final goodbye to the life I had built and lost. I drove past my house twice before gathering the courage to pull into the driveway. The house looked exactly as I had left it, though the lawn needed mowing, and the garden I had always kept meticulously was beginning to show signs of neglect. My ancient Honda, totaled in the accident, had been removed by insurance, leaving an empty space in the driveway that somehow made the house look more abandoned than it was. I sat in Margaret's car, which she had lent me for the day, and stared at the front door, trying to gather my strength. Walking inside felt like entering a tomb. The air was stale from weeks of being closed up, and dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the windows. Every object, every piece of furniture, every photograph on the walls held memories that cut like glass. The living room still had the couch where I had read bedtime stories to Dahlia and Douglas for years. The kitchen table where we had eaten countless meals together. The staircase where I had hung school photos documenting their growth from young children into adults. I started in the living room, working systematically through shelves and drawers. I found school projects I had saved, Macaroni art and hand-drawn Mother's Day cards with messages of love that now felt like lies. I found photographs of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduations, all documenting a family that had seemed so solid at the time. Looking at these images now was like watching a horror movie where you know the terrible ending, but the characters remain obliviously happy. In Dahlia's old room, unchanged since she left for college, I found her childhood diary hidden in the back of her closet. I knew I shouldn't read it, that whatever was inside belonged to her private thoughts, but I couldn't resist. Maybe there would be clues, hints of the resentment she claimed to have always felt. What I found instead was page after page of typical teenage angst, complaints about homework, excitement over boys she liked, worries about friend drama, and scattered throughout, expressions of love for me. One entry from when she was 15 stopped me cold. She had written about a fight we had over her curfew, how angry she had been at my rules, how she had told me she hated me in the heat of the moment. But then she wrote about how I had stayed calm, had explained my reasoning with patience, and had ended the conversation by telling her I loved her no matter how angry she got. She wrote that she was lucky to have me as her mom, that she knew not all kids had someone who cared so much. I sat on her bed, holding that diary, and tried to reconcile the girl who wrote those words with the woman who had coldly told hospital staff that I meant nothing to her. What had happened to transform one into the other? When had her father's poison begun to work on her? How long had she been pretending to love me while harboring this hidden resentment? The questions spun through my mind with no answers, no resolution, no peace. Douglas's room yielded similar artifacts of a childhood that now felt fictional. I found artwork he had given me over the years, carefully preserved in folders I had labeled with dates and descriptions. I found cards he had made me, including one for my 60th birthday that declared me the best mom in the world. I found a letter he had written when he was 16, apologizing for something he had said in anger, telling me that he knew I had sacrificed a lot to raise him and his sister, promising he would make me proud. The master bedroom was hardest. This had been my sanctuary, the one room in the house that belonged entirely to me. But even here, evidence of my children was everywhere. Photographs on the dresser, gifts they had given me displayed on shelves. A quilt Dahlia had helped me make one summer spread across the bed. I lay down on that quilt and let myself cry. Deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and primal inside me. By the time the sun began to set, I had made little actual progress in sorting through the house's contents. Instead, I had spent the day drowning in memories, each one a little death, a little goodbye to the person I had been and the family I thought I had. As I locked the front door behind me and walked to the car, I made a decision. I would hire someone to pack everything up. I couldn't do this. I couldn't dismantle my life piece by piece. It was too painful, and I had already suffered enough. Chapter 11. Moving forward. By mid-April, I had hired an estate sale company to handle the contents of my house. They would sort through everything, determine what had value, organize a sale for the public, and donate or dispose of anything that didn't sell. I gave them specific instructions about certain items. Dahlia and Douglas's childhood artwork and photographs were to be boxed and stored in case they ever wanted them, though I doubted they would. Everything else could go to whoever wanted it. The sale was held over a weekend, and I stayed away, unable to watch strangers pick through the remnants of my life. Margaret went for me, more out of curiosity than anything, and reported back that the house had been packed with people looking for bargains. My furniture sold quickly. My kitchen items were snapped up. Even my books found new homes. She said it was simultaneously sad and beautiful, watching pieces of my past scatter into the community to begin new lives with new families. The house itself sold 3 weeks later to a young couple expecting their first child. The real estate agent told me they were thrilled to find something in such a good neighborhood, with excellent schools nearby. The irony wasn't lost on me. The house I had bought specifically to provide a good environment for raising children, the neighborhood I had chosen for its schools and parks and safety, was passing to a new family who might actually appreciate what I had tried to build there. With the sale of the house and the rest of my estate settled, I found myself financially comfortable but emotionally adrift. I was 68 years old, in reasonably good health despite the accident, and facing a future that looked nothing like what I had imagined. I had no family, few friends, and no clear sense of purpose. Dr. Whitmore encouraged me to see this as an opportunity rather than an ending, but some days, that perspective felt impossible to achieve. I began volunteering at the foster care organization that would eventually inherit my house proceeds. The director, a passionate woman named Carolyn Rivers, welcomed me immediately and put me to work helping teenagers prepare for independent living. I taught them practical skills: how to budget, how to cook simple meals, how to fill out job applications. But more than that, I tried to give them something I had failed to give my own children: a sense that they were valued, that they mattered, that someone believed in them. Working with these kids was both healing and painful. I saw in them echoes of young Dahlia and Douglas, children who had lost so much and were trying to build lives from the rubble of their circumstances. But unlike my children, these teenagers never pretended to be anything other than what they were. They were honest about their anger, their fear, their desperate need for stability. That honesty, as raw as it was, felt more genuine than any interaction I had had with my children in recent years. One girl in particular, a 17-year-old named Kira with bright purple hair and a sharp wit, reminded me of Dahlia at that age. She had been bounced between foster homes for years, never quite fitting in anywhere, and she was aging out of the system in 6 months with no clear plan. I started meeting with her weekly, helping her apply for college scholarships, teaching her to drive, listening as she talked about her dreams of becoming a social worker. Kira asked me once why I spent so much time helping kids like her. I told her a version of the truth, that I had raised children who didn't appreciate what they had, and now I wanted to support young people who might value having someone in their corner. She looked at me with those wise, world-weary eyes that teenagers in the foster system often develop and said that it was their loss. That simple statement, offered without pity or judgment, meant more to me than she could have known. By late spring, I had developed a new routine: volunteering 3 days a week, therapy sessions that had decreased to every other week, physical therapy that was now maintenance rather than rehabilitation. I had also started painting again, a hobby I had abandoned decades ago when life became too busy with work and children. My small apartment had become a studio of sorts, canvases propped against walls, the smell of oil paint replacing the antiseptic scent that had clung to me after the hospital stay. Margaret occasionally joined me for dinner, sharing stories about her own life and family. She told me about her divorce 30 years ago, how her husband had left her for a younger woman, how she had rebuilt her life from that betrayal. She told me about the years she spent angry and bitter, and how she eventually learned that carrying that weight was only hurting herself. Her wisdom came from experience, and I tried to absorb it, to let it guide me toward some kind of acceptance. Nari, Chapter 12. The Letter That Changed Nothing. On a warm day in early June, nearly 7 months after the accident that had shattered my world, I received a letter. It came to my apartment, forwarded from my old address, and I recognized Douglas's handwriting immediately. My hands shook as I held it, debating whether to open it or simply throw it away unread. After several minutes of indecision, I carefully slit the envelope and pulled out 3 handwritten pages. Douglas wrote that he had been thinking about our last meeting at the hospital, about the things that had been said, about the choices he and Dahlia had made. He said he was sorry I felt hurt by their actions, though I noticed he didn't say he was sorry for the actions themselves. He explained that discovering their adoption had fundamentally changed how they saw their childhoods, that they had felt betrayed by what they perceived as deception about their origins. He wrote about their father, the man who had abandoned them, and how he had reappeared offering explanations and justifications for his absence. He painted a picture of a man who had wanted his children, but had been prevented from seeing them by circumstances beyond his control. I knew this was probably a lie, knew that their father had never made any effort to be part of their lives until they were old enough that he wouldn't have to do any actual parenting, but Douglas seemed to believe it. The letter went on to suggest that perhaps, with time, they could rebuild some kind of relationship with me. Not the same as before, he was careful to clarify, but something cordial and respectful. He acknowledged that they might have been hasty in their response to my accident, that perhaps the stress of the situation had made them react poorly. Again, I noticed the careful phrasing, the way he took responsibility without really taking responsibility. The final page contained what I suppose he thought was a generous offer. If I would reconsider my will, restore them as beneficiaries, they would be willing to visit occasionally, stay in touch more regularly, act like the children I had always wanted them to be. It was transactional, businesslike, and utterly devoid of genuine emotion or remorse. Douglas was essentially offering to pretend to love me in exchange for money, and he seemed to think this was a reasonable proposal. I read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing new waves of disappointment and anger. This was not an apology. This was not a recognition of the pain they had caused, or the cruelty of their rejection. This was a negotiation, an attempt to extract money from me while offering the bare minimum of human connection in return. The fact that Douglas thought this would work, that he believed I was desperate enough or foolish enough to accept such terms, was almost as hurtful as the original betrayal. I carried that letter with me all day, unable to decide how to respond. Patricia, who I still saw occasionally for coffee, listened as I read parts of it aloud. Her expression grew increasingly dismayed as I spoke, and when I finished, she said something I will never forget. She told me that some people will only value you for what you can give them, and once you stop giving, they stop pretending to care. She said it was better to know this truth than to live in comfortable delusion. That night, I sat at my small dining table with a pad of paper and began writing my own letter. I wrote about the 25 years I had devoted to raising them, about the sacrifices I had made gladly because I loved them, about the pride I had felt watching them grow into adults. I wrote about the pain of their rejection, the cruelty of their words, the calculating greed they had displayed when I was at my most vulnerable. I wrote about how their father's lies had poisoned them against someone who had only ever wanted their happiness. But then I stopped writing. I read what I had written and realized that none of it mattered. Douglas and Dahlia would never understand what they had done. They would never see me as anything other than an obligation they had been forced to endure, someone who had kept them from some idealized version of family that existed only in their father's manipulative stories. No letter I could write would change their minds or heal this breach. Any response would only give them ammunition for future negotiations. Instead, I took Douglas's letter, along with every photograph I still had of my children, and drove to the coast. It was a 2-hour drive to a small beach I had loved for years, a place where the wind was constant and the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon. I walked to the edge of the water, the cold Pacific waves washing over my feet, and I scattered the torn pieces of his letter into the surf. I didn't burn the photographs. That felt too dramatic, too final. I simply took them home and packed them away in a box I labeled the past and stored in Margaret's basement. The weeks that followed brought a strange peace. I stopped waiting for phone calls that would never come. I stopped replaying conversations in my mind, searching for things I could have said differently. I stopped hoping that some explanation would emerge that would make sense of my children's transformation from loving to cruel. I accepted that some questions have no answers, some wounds never fully heal, and some relationships cannot be saved no matter how much love you once poured into them. Kira, my young friend from the foster care program, got accepted to Portland State University on a full scholarship. The day she found out, she ran to find me, waving the acceptance letter and screaming with joy. We went out to celebrate, and over burgers and milkshakes, she told me that I had been instrumental in her success. She said I was the first person who had made her believe she was capable of more than just surviving. I cried then, happy tears this time, realizing that while I had failed with my own children, I could still make a difference in someone's life. As summer arrived, bringing rare sunny days to Portland, I found myself thinking less about Dahlia and Douglas and more about what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. I was 68, healthy enough despite lingering aches from the accident, and suddenly free of the obligations and expectations I had carried for decades. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I made plans to travel, something I had always put off. I researched painting classes at the community college. I said yes when Margaret invited me to join her book club. The story of my children's betrayal doesn't have a happy ending. There was no tearful reunion, no moment of realization where they understood what they had done and begged forgiveness. Douglas never responded to my non-response to his letter. Dahlia never called again. They faded from my life as completely as if they had never been part of it, existing somewhere out there in the world, living their lives without me, presumably happy with their choices. But my story wasn't over. I learned that you can survive the worst betrayal imaginable and still find reasons to wake up each morning. I learned that family isn't always about blood or legal ties, but about the people who show up for you when you need them most. I learned that loving someone deeply doesn't guarantee they will love you back, and that this painful truth doesn't diminish the value of the love you gave. I learned that you can be both heartbroken and hopeful, grieving and growing, wounded and still moving forward. On the anniversary of my accident, I drove past my old house. The young couple had painted the exterior a cheerful yellow, and children's toys were scattered across the front lawn. A tricycle leaned against the porch, and I could see flower boxes in the windows filled with bright geraniums. It looked like a home, like a place where a family was being built with love and intention. I felt a pang of loss for what I had tried to create there, but also a sense of rightness that new life was blooming in that space. Life, I had discovered, is filled with bitter lessons and sweet moments of unexpected grace. My children taught me that love is not always returned, that sacrifice is not always appreciated, that blood ties can be both stronger and weaker than we imagine. But Kira, Margaret, Patricia, and others who entered my life after my world fell apart taught me that chosen family can be just as real as biological family, that kindness often comes from unexpected places, and that it's never too late to start over. I still paint now, almost daily. My apartment walls are covered with canvases depicting the Oregon coast, the Portland skyline, the faces of people who have mattered to me. I volunteer at the foster care center 3 days a week, building relationships with teenagers who need someone to believe in them. I have coffee with Margaret every Thursday morning, and we talk about everything and nothing, building the kind of friendship that takes time and trust to develop. Do I still think about Dahlia and Douglas? Of course. They were my children for 25 years, and that doesn't simply evaporate because they chose to walk away. Some nights, I still wake up thinking about them, wondering how they're doing, whether they ever think of me with anything other than resentment. But these moments come less frequently now, and when they do, I've learned to acknowledge the grief and then let it pass like a wave rolling back into the ocean. The greatest lesson I learned from this experience is that you cannot force people to love you, no matter how much you love them. You cannot make them see your value if they have chosen to see you as worthless. You cannot fix a relationship when only one person wants it fixed. But you can survive their rejection. You can build a new life from the ruins of the old one. You can find meaning and purpose and even joy after the worst betrayal imaginable. My inheritance will go to young people aging out of foster care, to women rebuilding their lives after trauma, to teachers who want to make a difference. My house will provide shelter for children who need it. My savings will fund scholarships and support programs. This legacy feels right in a way that leaving everything to Dahlia and Douglas never did. Money and property mean nothing if they go to people who don't value what you built. But giving to those who will truly benefit, who will use these resources to build better futures, that feels like a worthy ending to my story. If I could give advice to anyone going through something similar, it would be this: grieve what you lost. But don't let that grief consume you. Acknowledge the pain, but don't let it define your future. Accept that some people will disappoint you in ways you never imagined possible, but don't let that make you bitter. There are still good people in the world, still opportunities for connection and love and purpose. You just have to be brave enough to keep looking for them, even when your heart has been broken. I am 69 now, nearly a year past the accident that changed everything. I am not the same woman I was before. That woman believed that love was enough, that sacrifice would be rewarded, that family bonds were unbreakable. I know better now, but I am also stronger, more resilient, more honest with myself about the nature of relationships and the reality that people can choose to hurt you even when you've done nothing to deserve it. My bed was never truly empty, even when my children abandoned me. It was filled with the lessons I learned, the strength I discovered, the new connections I formed. The letter I left wasn't one of despair or defeat, but one of hard-won wisdom and quiet determination. I survived their betrayal. I rebuilt my life. And while the ending isn't the one I would have chosen, it's an ending I can live with, one that honors the truth of my experience and the value of the love I still have to give, even if it must be given to people who aren't my children. The end. Reflection. This is a story about a woman who learned that being a mother doesn't guarantee being loved, that sacrifice doesn't ensure loyalty, and that the deepest wounds often come from those we trust most. But it's also a story about resilience, about finding new purpose when old dreams die, about discovering that life can surprise you with grace even in the midst of grief. Delilah Morehouse didn't get the family she deserved, but she built a life worth living anyway, and perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. You cannot control how others treat you, but you can always control how you respond, who you become, and where you find your meaning.